Good evening. I hope everyone can hear me. I think we'll get started. We'll probably have a few stragglers coming in. So welcome to our Lincoln Symposium here at Carthage College. And how appropriate it is for us to have this here. I think most of you know, but if you don't, Abraham Lincoln was a member of the Board of Trustees of this college for a period of time and did not resign from that position until after he became president. So it's, I think, really a neat thing that we are having this connection with Carthage today. Today also marks the 160th anniversary of the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is another wonderful reason to gather here and talk about Abraham Lincoln, and I know we're going to hear from Edna about this. The first thing that I want to do is recognize Dana. Dana, would you stand up? Dana Kroll. This could not have happened without Dana. She put this whole thing together and did just a fabulous job, and I really appreciate it, Dana, and I'm sure everybody does. So thank you for all of your hard work. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about this document. So I'm going to ask Dan Weinberg to come up here, who has brought this wonderful document, and just say a few words about it.
Will be a few words. Well, I thought it was the 160th anniversary of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, September 22nd. So I happen to have this with me, and I thought I'd bring it up just to show because it's a fun piece that was produced here in Wisconsin. It was lithographed in Milwaukee and published by Martin and Judson in Madison in 1864. And there were bunches of these that were produced commercially. I think there were somewhere around 53, 54 that were produced during Lincoln's lifetime. And this was one of them. And what it did, I'm going to go over here and just talk loudly, I hope. On one side are scenes of slavery. And on the other side, scenes of freedom. And on top, liberty and justice are here, and over here is the devil enslaving someone, and an angel breaking those chains, with Lincoln at the bottom and the Emancipation Proclamation in the middle. This was one of two that were done out here in the West. The other one was done in Chicago for the Sanitary Fair. Manny Mandel asked Lincoln to send him the original draft that he wrote. Lincoln didn't really want to do that and give it up, but he thought for the money, they were going to reproduce it for something like this, which they did, and Lincoln sent it out, and they reproduced it. It's a beautiful lithograph. But then the man was murdered, and there they had the Emancipation Proclamation, and they gave it to the Chicago Historical Society at the time. And then, of course, 1871 came and was burned to the ground. So that's how we lost the original in Lincoln's hand. But this is a beautiful one, so come up afterward and take a look. It's fun to see.
Thank you, Dan. The next thing I want to recognize is this is not just being hosted by Carthage College. This is being hosted also by the Lincoln Forum. And our chair, Harold Holzer, is here, and we're going to hear from him tomorrow. The Lincoln Forum is a group of Lincoln folks that gather in Gettysburg every year on November 16th, 17th, and 18th, leading up to the annual anniversary of the Gettysburg Address on the 19th. And I think this will be our 26th year, right, Harold? This will be the 27th year. And there should be a link in your program to the Lincoln Forum program coming up this November. It's a great lineup, and there are still tickets available, but not many. So if that is of interest to you to travel to Gettysburg, it's quite a fun time in November, as you might expect. It's a big deal in Gettysburg for the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. So if you want to come have some fun, meet some folks, and learn a thing or two about Lincoln, come to Gettysburg for a couple of days in November. And I can answer some questions about that, and Harold can too, if anybody has any. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the president of the college, John Swallow.
Well, on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank the Lincoln Forum, and I want to thank Patrick Anderson, class of 1985, and now a successor trustee to Abraham Lincoln, for generously supporting this event. This event would not have happened were it not for Patrick. Patrick is not only a class of 1985, he's also a parent, Carthage parent, of two wonderful students, class of 2023 and 2025. Yes, and one of them was showing me 5, just so I didn't make a mistake there. But we're so glad to have so many people here for this important symposium, celebrating 160 years after the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. We have gathered for tonight and tomorrow many distinguished speakers who have traveled here to Kenosha to be a part of this. And I have the privilege tonight to say how indeed fortunate we are that our keynote speaker will be Dr. Edna Medford. Edna has spent a long and distinguished career at Howard University as many things, I could say, as professor of history emeritus, most recently, as director of undergraduate studies, graduate studies, chair of the department, and then associate provost for faculty affairs. She began her educational post-secondary career at Hampton Institute, where she became a major in secondary education. She came to the great state of Illinois for her master's degree at the university, and then she went to Maryland for her PhD. She's written and published many things, given many talks, and then has been awarded many honors for that work, including 2009 Bicentennial Laureate Award from the Lincoln Academy of Illinois, which is presided over by the great state of Illinois' governor. In 2021, the Lincoln Forum, about which you've heard and co-sponsor of this event, gave her a Distinguished Recognition Award and started a scholarship in her name for students who would attend meetings of the Lincoln Forum. And so with that, I am so pleased to welcome her to the stage for securing the promise of the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln and Freedom for All.
Good evening. I want to thank President Swallow, Trustee Anderson, the Carthage staff members who I worked overtime today because I was making some last-minute changes to this talk, and I wasn't able to get it printed out at the hotel, so they scrambled and got it printed out for me. So I really do appreciate that. And I would like to thank the Lincoln Forum for co-hosting this. I am really honored to be a part of this program this evening. There is a scene in the 2012 film, Lincoln, in which the president and members of his administration are discussing a serious military development during the war. In the middle of the animated discussion, Lincoln blurts out, "Come on out, you old Reb, come on out," followed by, "This reminds me of a story." Edwin Stanton, his exasperated Secretary of War, yells, "No, you're going to tell one of your stories. I don't believe I can bear to listen to one of your stories right now." As Stanton storms out of the room, Lincoln continues his yarn about one of America's revolutionary heroes. The story goes, Ethan Allen travels to London after the war. Someone's seen the movie other than me. I've seen it 4 or 5 times. He's invited to the townhouse of an English lord, and after dinner and drinking, lots of drinking, he is shown to the restroom, where hangs a painting of George Washington. When he rejoins the guests, they all wait for him to respond to what they think will be an affront to their American visitor. When Allen fails to comment, his host asks what he thinks of the placement of Washington's portrait in a toilet. Allen answers that the portrait does its job because nothing will make an Englishman defecate quicker than the presence of George Washington. And he didn't use the word defecate. So I don't know if that is a true story or not. It's probably just a Hollywood invention. But the scene precisely captures a significant feature of Lincoln's personality, a part of the man that seemingly defies explanation unless you believe the quote ascribed to him that says, "With the fearful strain that is on me night and day, if I did not laugh, I would cry." Whether the quote is accurate or not, a fearful strain did indeed weigh upon him during the days of disunion and civil war. Those years of strain transformed his face from a healthy, vibrant man into an old, tired, nearly lifeless individual, seemingly devoid of the humor which was so important a part of his life. The burden of the presidency ages all men, and hopefully someday it'll age a woman as well. But Lincoln carried the double weight of preserving the Union and helping to destroy a constitutionally sanctioned institution that tarnished the nation's image on the world stage. That institution enriched one segment of the population while diminishing the economic opportunities of poor whites and denying the humanity of nearly 4 million Black men, women, and children. At every turn, he was placed in the unenviable position of pleasing no one and making enemies even among his friends. The burden was especially heavy for a man who was neither a proponent of slavery nor an abolitionist. Lincoln occupied a middle ground. He was an anti-slavery man who called for the gradual elimination of the institution through natural means. He rejected the views of the abolitionist who, since the 1830s, embraced the idea of immediatism, or finding an immediate solution to the problem of slavery. Now, we have to remember that abolitionists were not held in very high regard by many 19th century Americans, and there was an inclination to think of them as troublemakers. They were a very small percentage of the American population. Some have said no more than 1%. So they were seen as very radical individuals. As an anti-slavery man throughout his adult life, he came late to the abolitionist cause. His views were closer to the mainstream of American thought than to those espoused by what were considered the more radical elements in national politics. He found slavery distasteful and immoral, but he was willing to tolerate it until it died a natural death. Lincoln's journey from anti-slavery to abolitionism was guided by his interpretation of the meaning of the founding documents. He believed in American exceptionalism and the extraordinary model this nation offers for the rest of the world. He contrasted America's founding principles with those of other countries and found their origins wanting. Most governments have been based practically on the denial of equal rights of men, he wrote. Ours began by affirming those rights. They said, some men are too ignorant and vicious to share in government. Possibly so, said we, and by your system, you would always keep them ignorant and vicious. We proposed to give all a chance, and we expected the weak to grow stronger, the ignorant wiser, and all better and happier together. Nevertheless, Lincoln recognized that this sentiment clashed with the reality of American society at its founding and since. He could not ignore the contradiction between the advocacy of liberty for all and the simultaneous enslavement of 750,000 people, a number that grew to nearly 4 million on the eve of the war. He attempted to reconcile this contradiction by arguing that the founders were aware of the inherent hypocrisy, but had been forced to leave slavery intact to secure national unity. So embedded was the institution in the social and economic fabric in the Southern colonies, Lincoln thought the founders considered it akin to a cancer whose immediate removal would endanger the body. Their intention, he believed, was to isolate it and allow it to die naturally, to leave slavery in place in the states where it already existed, but prevent it from spreading into the Western territories. Those free areas were to be reserved for non-slaveholding white men who could take full advantage of what America had to offer. It bears noting that many of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were themselves slaveholders, whose daily actions countered the principles they claimed to hold dear. While they had the opportunity to personally rid themselves of slavery, few did, and those who did often waited to free their human property when death rendered the need for labor of bondsmen and women unnecessary. Leaders like George Washington claimed their abhorrence of slavery in private, but were unwilling to use their popularity to attack the institution publicly. And then there was Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, who famously put a quote in the document criticizing the British king for introducing slavery into the colonies. Not surprisingly, he was told to strike the clause from the Declaration. Jefferson famously or infamously elected to free only just a very few of his large slaveholding population, and most of those, if not all of them, were the offspring of Sally Hemings, and I'll say no more about that. Lincoln's background differed from that of the founders. Neither the scion of a prominent family nor a person of great individual wealth, unless you count his railroad representing days, which was pretty lucrative. He embodied the American dream like no other president had before him. Lincoln was the quintessential self-made man, the male version of Cinderella, whose glass slipper came as a reward for service to country, specifically his lifelong commitment to democracy and freedom. Yet he was neither socially progressive nor politically radical. He accepted the prevailing racial views of his day, embracing the supremacy of white men and women over other races, and frequently making Black people the subject of off-color and racially insensitive jokes. He had mutually respectful associations with a few Black people, such as William Flurville, his barber, and he could exhibit a great deal of sympathy for individuals. But he saw most, if not all, Black people as inferior to whites intellectually. Those who take the time to try to understand Lincoln's ideas about the intellectual capacity of Black people point to his argument that slavery had damaged the enslaved. And while I take issue with his conclusion that they were thus inferior, I agree that slavery had no benefits for those who were its victims. Whether laboring in the tobacco fields of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, standing in the disease and snake-infested waters of the rice-growing regions of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, in the cotton fields throughout the South, or in the many industries that utilized enslaved labor, the system was meant to dehumanize Black people. Slavery was so much more than the exploitation of labor. It denied the enslaved the right to protect their families, husbands their wives, and parents the ability to exert authority over their children. The separation of families, the cruelest feature of slavery, from my perspective at least, was commonplace as the Upper South region fueled the domestic trade by supplying surplus laborers to the economies in the Deep South. The presence of a slave trader and the beginning of a new year were met with dread because they signaled the potential for sale and separation. Presumably, Lincoln knew this, and he lamented the misery caused by slavery. But that knowledge did not lead to radicalism. He held moderate political views, especially as concerned slavery. Although there was a radical component of the Republican Party, he was not a member of that wing. And despite his strong feelings against the institution, he was still able to defend a slaveholder, Kentuckian Robert Matson, in his effort to recover an enslaved family that had fled his household. Lincoln believed that enslaved people were, under the Constitution, legal property, and that slaveholders under the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act had the right to retrieve runaways. Matson had brought Jane Bryant and 4 of her children to Illinois, where he had kept them enslaved for 2 years, contrary to Illinois law that permitted enslaved people to be in the state while in transit to another area, but for less than 1 year. When Matson's housekeeper threatened to sell at least one of the Bryant children to the South, the father of the children, who was the free husband of Jane Bryant, sought the assistance of abolitionists. They sheltered the family and sued for freedom of mother and children on the grounds that the slaveholder was in violation of Illinois law. Lincoln's motivation for representing Matson is unclear. It has been argued that he may have been experiencing financial difficulties, or as a lawyer, he could not withhold his services from someone who requested it. I find that excuse interesting. Lawyers in the room, think about that one. We do know that he represented at least one enslaved person in a freedom case prior to Matson. It is one of many inconsistencies that keep scholars busy and those who admire Lincoln scrambling for justification. Whatever his motivation in the Matson case, Lincoln recognized the damage slavery inflicted on the nation's reputation. The year before taking his seat as a one-term congressman, he noted the national embarrassment of slave trading occurring in the shadow of the Capitol. In describing William's pen, a slave pen in Washington, he wrote of, quote, a peculiar species of slave trade in the District of Columbia, in connection with which, in full view from the windows of the Capitol, a sort of Negro livery stable where droves of Negroes were collected, temporarily kept, and finally taken to Southern markets, precisely like droves of horses. The presence of slavery in the nation's capital sparked a heated debate while Lincoln was in Congress. The future president sought to take part in it by proposing a solution that reflected his long-standing reviews of how slavery should be addressed. He drafted a plan by which abolition would be achieved gradually. Owners would have to give consent and be compensated for the loss of their human property. Children born of enslaved mothers after January 1st, 1850 would be free, but obligated to serve the mother's owner for a currently undetermined length of time as an apprentice. And of course, during that period, usually apprentices served, if they were women, until they were 18, and if they were men, until they were 21. Would-be supporters for Lincoln's plan fell away when pressure was exerted by Southern congressmen, forcing him to abandon the bill. Lincoln returned to Springfield and resumed his law practice, but a series of events in the 1850s propelled him back into the political arena as the nation grappled with what to do with the property that had been ceded to the U.S. following the war with Mexico. Although he was in Congress when the debates over slavery's role in this territory first began, he did not engage in the discussion, but did support Congressman David Wilmot's proviso that the institution be banned from the area. In 1850, Congress agreed to outlaw the slave trade in the district, and in District of Columbia, that is, and enacted a new Fugitive Slave Act that compelled free states to assist in the apprehension of enslaved people who had escaped their bondage. And this is an American law that if you read it, you should find it appalling, because the onus, the burden is put on the person who it is claimed is enslaved. And you have these commissioners who are set up to listen to these cases, and they get more money for sending this human being into slavery than they get for releasing that person. So it's one of the most un-American laws that I have ever read. Lincoln found the Fugitive Slave Act to be a dirty, disagreeable job, yet he did not object to it if its enforcement was no more, quote, likely to carry a free man into slavery than our ordinary criminal laws are to hang an innocent one. And we know that there are lots of folk who are executed who are not guilty of the crimes that they've committed, or at least have served many, many years in prison for something they didn't do. Enslaved laborers were property protected by the Constitution. This is what Lincoln is saying. Protected by the Constitution, and the slaveholder had the right to retrieve his absconding laborers. As the nation became increasingly divided, Lincoln put forth his views in speeches and in private letters to friends and adversaries alike. The Kansas-Nebraska Act drove him even further into the anti-slavery camp. Proposed by Stephen A. Douglas, U.S. Senator from Illinois, as a means for getting a transcontinental railroad built with Chicago as a terminus, the act permitted the organization of territorial governments in Kansas and Nebraska, with the provision that the residents would determine whether slavery would be allowed to exist within its borders. This nod to popular sovereignty, as it was called, drew sharp criticism, as it voided the 1820 so-called Missouri Compromise, in which the territory acquired through the Louisiana Purchase had been divided between slave and free states, and the Kansas Territory fell within the zone of freedom. It was against this backdrop that Lincoln gave a speech in Peoria, Illinois, in which he argued that slavery was a monstrous injustice that enabled the enemies of freedom to deride America as a nation of hypocrites. Since the founders could not eradicate slavery outright, they sought to limit the transatlantic trade in human cargo. Allowing it to expand into the territories, he believed, would increase the demand and possibly lead to the reopening of the slave trade. And there were some serious debates about whether the transatlantic slave trade should be reopened. And this is at a time when the rest of the world is actually frowning on that idea of the transatlantic slave. Not that none of them are doing it. Some of them are definitely doing it illegally, and it's happening in America as well. Equally important to Lincoln was the advantages the Western territories gave to the non-slaveholding farmer, as I've mentioned before. Slave states are places for poor white people to remove from, he argued. New free states are the places for poor people to go to and better their conditions. The intense divisions over slavery that accompanied passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed Lincoln's Whig Party and severely damaged the Democrats. It precipitated a mini civil war in Kansas and brought Lincoln out of political retirement. The new Republican Party that emerged suited his thinking just fine. Its platform in 1856 supported his own beliefs and mirrored the nation's founding principles. The platform read, "To be resolved, that with our Republican fathers, we hold it to be a self-evident truth that all men are endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the primary object and ulterior design of our federal government were to secure these rights to all persons under its exclusive jurisdiction. That as our Republican fathers, when they had abolished slavery in all our national territory, ordained that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, it becomes our duty to maintain this provision of the Constitution against all attempts to violate it for the purpose of establishing slavery in the territories of the United States by positive legislation prohibiting its existence or extension thereof." So what they're saying is the founding fathers had intended that this thing not be expanded, and Americans of that time had the burden, had the responsibility of ensuring that it not be expanded. A year later, the Supreme Court ruled in Scott versus Sanford that slaveholders could take their property anywhere they wished, including the territories, that Black people were not citizens of the United States and hence had no legal standing in the courts, and that they had no rights white men were bound to respect. Lincoln reviewed the disabilities suffered by African Americans and found that certain rights that had been extended in the early years of the Republic had been taken away. "In those days," he wrote, "our Declaration of Independence was held sacred by all and thought to include all. But now, to aid in making the bondage of the Negro universal and eternal, it is assailed and sneered at, and construed and hawked at, and torn till its framers, could rise from if their framers could rise from their graves, they could not at all recognize it." In the 1858 U.S. senatorial election in Illinois, Lincoln challenged the incumbent Democratic candidate, Stephen A. Douglas. The debates between the two men revealed the maturation of Lincoln's thinking on the role of slavery at America's founding and the role it was likely to play in the future. He reiterated his views that Congress could not interfere with slavery where it already existed, but that it could stop its expansion into the Western territories. He also sought to respond to Douglas's claim that Republicans were in favor of equality of the races and amalgamation. So those were the dog whistles of that era. Lincoln argued that equality did not mean that all were equal in every way, but everyone was equal when it came to the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and happiness. He offered that he had never been in favor of bringing about social and political equality between Black and white people. He claimed that the physical differences between the two races made it impossible for them to live as equals. As long as they occupied the same space, the white race must hold the superior position. His response to the charge of amalgamation was that slavery was responsible for racial mixing and that it gave the slaveholder the opportunity to abuse bondwomen. If slavery was not allowed to expand, the races could be separated and amalgamation would be resolved. Although Lincoln did not win the senatorial election, the debates enhanced his stature in the political arena. When 2 years later, the new Republican Party selected a presidential candidate, Lincoln's moderate stance on slavery earned him the nomination on the third ballot. He beat out candidates that were better known, but their more radical views made them less acceptable to the party. By the time of the election, division over the issue of slavery had reached a critical point. Lincoln became the 16th president, but did not carry a single slaveholding state. By the end of the year, South Carolina, the maverick of American politics, going back many years, made good on its threat to leave the Union if Lincoln prevailed. Mississippi soon followed, along with several other southern states. In the end, 4 slaveholding sister states remained, but the disloyalty of many of their citizens became a consistent thorn in the side of the national government. Lincoln remained silent publicly during the transition, but he voiced his views on secession through private communications with friends. Those letters reveal that although he was seriously concerned about secession, he refused to compromise on the expansion of slavery into the territories. Let there be no compromise on the question of extending slavery, he wrote. If there be, all our labor is lost, and ere long must be done again. The dangerous ground, that into which some of our friends are hankering to run, is popular sovereignty. Have none of it. Stand firm. The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter. As he waited to take office, plans were in motion by political leaders on both sides to mend the fracture. A peace conference held in the District of Columbia in February 1861 failed because of refusal to compromise. Most of the delegates wanted to give the South more than what it was entitled to, sure. Another effort by Ohio Congressman Thomas Corwin, a proposed constitutional amendment that aimed to forbid Congress in perpetuity from interfering with slavery in the states where it already existed, passed both houses by significant margins. This 13th Amendment, if it had been ratified, this 13th Amendment was prepared to be sent out for ratification and was accompanied by Lincoln's signature. Ohio and Maryland did ratify, but the process was stopped when South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter, the federal installation in Charleston Harbor. The irony is that it would be replaced in just a few years by another 13th Amendment that, rather than protect slavery in perpetuity, actually abolished it throughout the nation. Just a short time before, Lincoln had sought in his inaugural address to reassure that the national government meant no harm to the seceded states. He pledged to protect the property rights of the secessionists, specifically their human property, through enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. But Lincoln also spoke about a perpetual union that could not be destroyed under the Constitution. His remarks pleased few, as Southerners took his stance on the inviolability of the Union as an assault on their independence and states' rights. Abolitionists, especially African Americans, could not understand why he was so eager to protect property in enslaved laborers when the slaveholders had launched a rebellion against their government. Yet Lincoln remained anti-slavery and pro-union, and for now, he was determined to do whatever was possible to prevent the fracture from widening. Short of allowing slavery to expand, he was willing to do almost anything to to bring the seceded states back into the Union, nor was he prepared to attack slavery where it already existed. The war challenged Lincoln's thinking and altered his approach and timeline for ending this existential threat to the nation. The attack on Fort Sumter in April left him with the dilemma of either letting the seceded states go their own way or use force to keep them in the fold. Given his stance on a perpetual union, he had a single choice: call up troops and quell the rebellion. The 75,000 volunteers solicited in July would prove to be sorely inadequate for the task. When the Union Army was trounced at the Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln and the North recognized that the job of reunion would be neither easy nor immediate. Still, Lincoln was not yet prepared to attack slavery. The abolitionists in Congress preceded him in recognizing the role that enslaved laborers and free black men could play in crushing the rebels. The North recognized that the Confederates had an advantage in its use of enslaved labor to work in the fields and provide military labor in the form of erecting fortifications and serving in other non-combatant capacities. In the first Confiscation Act, Congress authorized the seizure of any property, including enslaved people, who had been used to wage war against the nation. Lincoln signed the bill, but did so reluctantly, perhaps because he was still mulling over his options, or because at this point in the war, he was still trying to secure the return of the seceded states. Seizing their enslaved property might escalate matters. From the very beginning of the war, the abolitionists and black men had pressed Lincoln and Congress to include African Americans in the fight. Both the president and many congressmen rejected the idea, electing instead to use them as military laborers. Lincoln had no confidence in these men, that these men would be able to stand up on the battlefield to former owners and to white men. In response to calls for their employment on the battlefield, Lincoln replied, "If we were to arm them, I fear that within a few weeks, the arms will be in the hands of the rebels." Moreover, admitting black men to the Union forces would weaken the argument that this was a white man's war. It would send a wrong message to the secessionists, and most importantly, to the border states, who were vehemently opposed to making this a war about freedom and equality. The enslaved themselves had other ideas. Even before the firing on Fort Sumter, they saw the struggle between white men as their opportunity to end slavery and to secure those rights accorded to other Americans. As the Union Army advanced, enslaved men and women took the opportunity to flee their bondage, forcing the Lincoln administration to deal with the mounting problem. Without clear guidance from Washington initially, commanders in the field determined whether to return these people to their secessionist owners. Reports soon surfaced of returnees being murdered by enraged masters. Such incidents prompted scathing criticism of Lincoln, who found himself in the unenviable position of being vilified by his enemies and lambasted by his friends as well. By the fall of 1861, Lincoln was prepared to acknowledge slavery's potential for inciting future discord. Believing that the Constitution did not permit Congress or the national executive to touch slavery in the states, he solicited the assistance of the southern states that had remained in the Union, those other border states. He hoped that if he could convince them to adopt a plan of gradual emancipation, the other slaveholding states would abandon the rebellion. As a test case, he devised a plan for Delaware, a border state with fewer than 2,000 enslaved laborers in 1860. Lincoln's Delaware plan outlined two potential avenues for ending slavery. One involved a gradual emancipation that would free a portion of the enslaved immediately, with the rest becoming free in increments over the next few years. The second approach, and supposedly the one that he preferred because he was a gradualist, was to make emancipation more gradual, extending it into the 1890s. In both approaches, the owner would be compensated for the loss of his or her property, but despite its generous provisions, Delaware rejected both plans. While he sought state-initiated gradual abolition, Lincoln rejected the attempt of two of his generals to emancipate in areas under their command. In September 1861, General John Fremont, commander of the Department of the West, which included Missouri, declared as free the enslaved people, the enslaved property of disloyal owners. Lincoln promptly instructed Fremont to bring his decree within conformity of the First Confiscation Act. When he refused to do so, the president ordered him to comply. The following summer, when General David Hunter, commander of the Department of the South, issued an emancipating decree in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, without notifying the president, Lincoln nullified it. Of importance is Lincoln's suggestion that he would decide the issue of emancipation if it became militarily necessary. He continued to appeal to the border state representatives to take action that he argued would be in their best interest. Not ready to give up their valuable commodity in enslaved laborers, none of the states heeded his warning. The lack of progress in persuading the border states to implement plans of emancipation, failures on the battlefield, in particular McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, the difficulty in securing volunteers for military service, and increasing pressure from the abolitionists, and there was a lot of that pressure, all operated to push Lincoln toward executive action. Viewing emancipation from the precedents established by international laws of war, he concluded that his position as commander-in-chief gave him the authority on the grounds of military necessity to quell the rebellion by seizing or destroying the property of the insurgents. After notifying his cabinet of his intentions, he waited until the Union had a victory on the battlefield so as not to look like the action was, in Secretary of State Seward's words, the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, our last shriek on the retreat. On September 17th, Union victory of sorts at Antietam provided Lincoln with the opportunity to expand the aim of the war from preservation of the Union to emancipation. 5 days later, on September 22nd, 160 years ago today, the president who had pledged not to interfere with slavery in the states sent an ultimatum to the secessionists: return to the Union in 100 days or be prepared to lose your enslaved laborers. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation reiterated Lincoln's war aim of practically restoring the constitutional relation between the seceded states and the Union. He also committed to securing Congress's financial assistance to any state that pursued either gradual or immediate abolition, and he sought to allay the fears of those troubled by the idea of having free Black men and women living in their midst by proposing voluntary deportation or consensual colonization. When on January 1st, 1863, the Confederate States did not accept Lincoln's plan, he issued the final proclamation. Lincoln made it very clear that his action was grounded in military necessity and that his decree affected only those states or parts of states still under Confederate control. The proclamation exempted the 4 border states that had remained in the Union, certain parishes in Louisiana, and parts of southeastern Virginia that were occupied by Union forces, and the state of Tennessee, where a Unionist government had been established under the leadership of Andrew Johnson. In all, roughly 3.1 million people received the promise of freedom, while 830,000 remained outside of the decree's reach. Yet Americans who championed freedom surmised that this bold step would help to erode slavery throughout the country. Gone from the final proclamation was any mention of colonization or of compensation to the owners. Beyond emancipation, the most important clause of the final proclamation, at least for Black people, authorized the enlistment of Black soldiers. Henceforward, Black men would be allowed to fight for the Union cause while serving as an army of liberation. It was the aim they had been pursuing since the beginning of the war, not simply because they felt compelled to defend the idea of union, but because they sought the kind of recognition accorded to those who took up arms for a national cause. Black men understood, as Frederick Douglass had so eloquently stated, once the African American was given the opportunity to don the Union blue and shoulder a weapon, there is no power on the earth or under the earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. Despite the extraordinary significance of the proclamation, Lincoln and Northerners understood that slavery might be reinstated after the war was over, when military necessity could no longer be employed as a justification for emancipation. During the war, public opinion had shifted in favor of finding a permanent solution that would ensure the institution never again threatened national union. How to do this became the topic of intense debate by the end of 1863 and into 1864, when the Republicans proposed a constitutional amendment that would forever outlaw human bondage. Contrary to the implications left by Spielberg's movie, Lincoln initially did not publicly endorse such action by Congress. He continued to believe that sweeping universal emancipation was within the jurisdiction of the states. But by June 1864, he was ready to declare his support for a constitutional solution. After the November election, he put his full effort behind the measure, and that's what we see in the Spielberg movie. Lincoln, the abolitionist, allegedly sanctioning methods that some would consider extra-legal at best. The 13th Amendment was ratified by the requisite number of states in December 1865. Lincoln would not live to see the monstrous evil defeated and America move closer to realizing the promise of the Declaration of Independence. His journey from anti-expansion of slavery to abolition had been shaped by his faith in the founding documents and by his uncompromising commitment to making America what it had always claimed to be. Along the way, he sometimes embraced ideas characteristic of his times, racial biases, and the rights of private property over the rights of human beings. Nevertheless, for scholars and the public alike, Lincoln embodies the American ideal of what a leader should be: resolute, empathetic, a careful and cautious thinker, selfless, a person of integrity, a symbol of unity. Even with his faults, he represents hope and reminds us of the power of individuals to successfully challenge practices and beliefs that take us away from the guiding principles that are supposed to make America exceptional. We often talk about Lincoln's unfinished work, as if death cut short his ability to fix everything that was broken. In reality, the task has always been unfinishable. The struggle is meant to be ongoing, as each generation decides for itself what kind of society it wishes to leave for the next. Whether it was by the accident of war or by design, Lincoln and his generation bequeathed to the societies that followed them the tools with which to build on their extraordinary achievements. Our contribution to that ongoing quest for freedom and equality remains uncertain. I would hope that 160 years from now, future generations will still be talking about Lincoln and freedom, and that our descendants will be able to look back on this time as a moment when Lincoln's cherished ideas survived. Thank you.
Thank you, Edna, and we certainly have some time for some questions, and I will lead it off. So, obviously, we know all these wonderful things that Abraham Lincoln did, and and you also touched on some of the terrible things that he said about people of color. For example, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, some things that he thought and wrote. Is it fair to identify Abraham Lincoln as a racist?
Patrick, I'm going to get you for that one.
How's that an easy? Is that an easy question or what?
You know, I always get a similar question to that, but not quite that one. And the one is about judging people in our time versus their time. Mm-hmm. And my position is presentism should be out the window. That's not what we should be doing. But we should still consider the extent to which people practiced or recognized humanity. Humanity does not change over time. People are people from beginning to end. And so I think we do have to look at people from the perspective of how they treat other individuals. Terms like racist, I don't think fit here, but what we do, at least what I have attempted to do in the years that I have studied Lincoln, is to understand what was motivating him, why he did what he did, and I'm not so sure that I'm any closer to understanding him than, and I don't think most of us are. I mean, I think in general, historians are still struggling with that one. I think that he was very much a man of his times, okay? I think that it is not useful for us to try to fit him into our times with our values, but I do think that we need to remember that there were people who did not tell racist jokes, okay? There were people who did put human beings before private property. And so I try to look at that era from that perspective. And so, you know, there are lots of people who are fighting for Black rights from day one. And that's not what Lincoln is doing. Lincoln is trying to preserve the Union initially. That doesn't mean that he didn't want slavery to end. I'm always struck by the end of the final Emancipation Proclamation, where he's been talking about military necessity throughout this. But in the end, in that closing statement, it is clear that he sees this as a very important thing from a humanitarian perspective. And I think that's what we want to see in our leaders. And that is there in the end.
Okay, we can open it up, and Dana's got a microphone for anyone that wants to ask Edna a question.
I'm not sure I need a microphone. Maybe I will have a microphone. I was interested in your comment about how after the war, slavery might even return. But in the document, even the September version of the document, it refers to the fact that the areas where slavery will, because of the Emancipation Proclamation, be removed, the slaves will be forever free.
But that's absolutely true. But there's nothing that stops them from enslaving other people, okay? There's no, I mean, just because you have freed a certain group of people, yeah, a whole new group of enslaved people, whether they're coming in from the outside or you are just simply waylaying people and dragging them into slavery, because that happened too. There were free black people who were dragged into slavery. So there was absolutely nothing to prevent that. And Lincoln was very concerned about that, as were the abolitionists as well. So it was a real possibility. And the transatlantic slave trade could have been reopened at any time.
Could you talk a little bit about during this period when, Lincoln was almost undecided, he had conflicting views almost. What were the European views of Lincoln, the British, the French, and were they trying to influence him one way or the other?
It's interesting. It really is interesting how Europeans are responding, say, to the Emancipation Proclamation. The rank and file European is all for it because these people have already, committed themselves to free labor. The aristocrats and the government think he has lost his mind. They think he's just stupid to be doing something like this. Because keep in mind, England and France especially are benefiting from enslaved labor in America. So they don't care if 4 million people are enslaved. But the British people care, the French people care to the extent that they are wedded to a free labor system. So yeah, Lincoln is just, he's not highly regarded by the governments of these nations, of the European governments, and he's not highly regarded by those leaders there, whether they're, members of royalty or they're just regular old government officials who really do have power.
On the day that he signs the final emancipation, there's that beautiful story where he's going to sign his signature. And he begins to sign it, and he stops. Right. And he says, I've been shaking hands all day because it's New Year's Day. And he says, my hand's almost paralyzed from shaking hands. And he says, I'm going to sign this document. And he says, if they see a shaky hand, they're going to say, he hesitated. And then he has this, what I think is a really poignant statement. And he says, if my name ever goes down for anything, it will be for this one act, and my heart and soul is all in it. I think it's such a wonderful statement because he doesn't say, if I save the Union, I'm going to be remembered. He says, if my name's ever remembered, it will be for this one act. I'm wondering how you look at that in conjunction with your prior statements about viewing him.
Yeah, I think he was sincere about that, but I also think that his hand was shaking because he realized how serious what he was doing was. It could have really gone south very quickly. I think we sometimes forget how bold that was, for that time. So he didn't know how that was going to turn out. It was, he knew that he had the support of Northerners behind him, some Northerners behind him. There were a lot of people who were against it. And there were folk who kept on trying to get him to rescind it as well. But he never does. And I think there are two reasons why he does. And I think he genuinely wants slavery to end. He just is willing to have it go on for as long as it needs to go on. But when he sees the country just, dissolving into war, he recognizes that this can't continue, that this institution is going to keep coming back over and over again to weaken the nation. Even if he got the southern states to come back into the Union, he knew that at some point this issue would rise again. And so I think he really does care about protecting the nation from another incident like that. But I think you're right. There's that other part too, the humanitarian part that's come out. It's there in the Declaration of Independence. Excuse me, the Emancipation Proclamation. I don't know what time this is, but it's there in the proclamation. It's also there in that statement. He's a very complex individual. That's why we love to study him. He's not some historical figure that has no depth. He's really somebody that you can really dig into the history and still come up not knowing what the hell he was all about. That's the reality for me. I don't know about the rest of you historians out there.
Does this Emancipation Proclamation apply? Yes, it could have repeated itself, but he only applies it to those southern states. He doesn't apply it to the border states or the northern states. So slavery is going to continue, and he supersedes Congress. So he's not really ending slavery.
That's true. He's freeing people in areas of the South that are still under the Confederacy because he has the authority to do that. He doesn't have the authority to go into Maryland and Missouri and Delaware and Kentucky and free anyone because those folk are not in rebellion. Okay, he can't. Well, he could have gone into Tennessee and freed them, but he decided you got a government, a unionist government that's forming there. Why mess with it? Go on and support them and let slavery continue. That's another instance where it's like, what is the most important thing for the nation? And we might disagree with that, but from his perspective and from the perspective of those people who supported him, they felt it was necessary to do it that way. Now, people like Frederick Douglass and others who read the proclamation and realized that, not everybody was going to be freed, they understood that the horse was out of the barn, so to speak. You can't put it back in there. The process is already started. And so once, it was Douglass who said, once slavery is dead in Virginia, it cannot continue in Maryland. Because what's going to happen is people in Maryland are going to flee to the free areas, and that's what they're doing anyway. After emancipation in DC in April of '62, you've got Maryland enslaved people just swarming the city. They're doing it even before that, but they're really doing it after that. So you're not going to be able to contain these other people. They are going to go where there is freedom. So everybody was, most people, I can't say everybody, the people who wanted slavery to end were pleased with the proclamation because it opened the door. You're absolutely right. It does not end slavery forever. The 13th Amendment, it does that. But we do need to recognize how important the proclamation was as a bold step toward the eventual eradication of slavery in America. Dan?
Two quick things. One, you mentioned very briefly that the populace had changed its thoughts on emancipation so it could come forward. Mm-hmm. What changed it for the whole populace? Mm-hmm. And secondly, there was a letter that Lincoln wrote in private in the 1850s, George Robinson, I think it was, where he said that slavery is not going to end without war. Could one say then that he was a radical in being the first president to allow war to come over slavery?
Okay, does he allow war to come over slavery,
Well,
or
he
does
was
he
ready
allow war to come to reunite the nation? Because he doesn't get to the abolition part until he realizes that he's not going to win this war unless he does something drastic, because the Confederacy is doing pretty well. So there's a possibility that the nation is going to be split forever. So I wouldn't say that he goes to war. He goes to war over the issue of slavery, over the issue of the expansion of slavery. But if the Confederates had not done what they did, I think we actually should thank the Confederacy, because without them leaving the Union, slavery would have continued for a while at least. So I wouldn't say that he goes to war to end slavery. He goes to war to preserve the Union, and in the process, he helps to end slavery as well. And I think that he did care about both. People who say, he didn't care about slavery, I think that's wrong. He does care. But his first priority is preservation of the Union. And whatever he can do to affect that is what he will do. And freeing those folk in the areas that are still held by the Confederacy is the beginning of that.
And so what change the population?
Yeah. So the opinion changes, I think, because of the war itself, because people didn't realize how bad the war was going to be. I mean, everybody thought, the Union will wrap this thing up in a few days and everybody can go home and they'll be back to normal. That's not the way it happened. So it's a war with a lot of death and destruction. People understand that this issue of slavery is going to go on and on and on until it is eliminated. And I think black men have something to do with it as well, because a lot of them, upwards of 200,000, are fighting on the side of the Union. They are showing themselves more, I started to use the word patriotic. I don't want to use that word because that word suggests some things that I don't think is what's happening there. But they recognize that they can help to make America a better place, at least for themselves. And they're willing to make the sacrifice. And you see white men seeing that, and they realize that something has to be done about this institution. So it's a variety of things that are occurring.
Maybe one or two more questions.
Yes, I can.
No, we can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Wait for the microphone.
She has. No. Not on, I don't think.
But I can hear you. So,
Can you hear me?
yes,
All right.
yes.
So it's about the debate between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Prior to joining debate, Lincoln was advised to analyze if you go against slavery, would that be a political liability or would that be a political capital? So he did an analysis and he decided to go against Stephen Douglas on that point. So in other words, do you see there's a transformational process in Abraham Lincoln in terms of his attitude towards slavery? One is for his political agenda. By the way, you help enslaved people. On the other hand, he also has some genuine sincerity, to help with this situation. That debate shows a lot of the two sides. So can you comment a little bit more? What are the Lincoln's political calculation to position himself there against Douglas?
Okay, I think I understand what you're asking. From what I'm hearing, you're asking basically to what extent is Lincoln using the slavery issue to promote his own agenda, his own advancement. Is that what you're asking?
A winning strategy, as part of his winning strategy in that debate.
Okay, so, yeah. Lincoln was a politician, okay? I think we sometimes forget that he was a very good politician. And yes, he understood how to win elections. But the position he took at that time was very unpopular in many areas of Illinois. And if you look at how he responds to some of Douglas's arguments to him, he gets very, what's the word I want to use? He plays along with Douglas to a certain extent. He knows the population he's talking to, and he talks to that. He tailors his words to his audience. Does he believe everything that he says? He's a politician, okay? So probably not. I don't have a problem with him trying to win an election by saying things that he didn't believe, but I think it's how you say it. I mean, if you're in politics, you gotta tell people what they want to hear if you want to win. And we see too many instances of people losing elections because they are honest, because people don't want to hear the truth. So it takes a very special person and a very special audience, actually, to be willing to hear the truth and for the politician to be willing to tell it. So I don't think Lincoln is any different from any other. I'm more concerned about what he did as opposed to what he said, except when he uses language and he makes suggestions that certain groups of people are inferior. And I don't think that he always needed to go there, but he did because he's a white man of the 19th century, you know, born in Kentucky, raised in Indiana and Illinois, raised in Indiana and then moving to Illinois. So I'm not judging him because of where he was born and when he was born, but I would have still wished that he had been a little bit more careful in how he said things. Someone told me once that my problem was that I wanted Lincoln to be something he could never be. And that may be true. That's my problem, I guess. So.
One more.
So this works, right? Right. In addressing kind of your sentiments about the legacy of slavery after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment itself has provisions in it that allow for slavery to exist as punishments for a crime. And earlier in your presentation, you admitted that some of these crimes are attributed to people who did not commit crimes or crimes that should not be considered crimes. And so I was curious as to your perspective on the ways that slavery might exist in today's society.
Yeah, see, I don't quite buy that argument about how, you know, 13th Amendment really didn't free people because it's got that clause in there, except for as punishment for crimes, you know. That clause is in the Northwest Ordinance. The clause is in other areas as well. I don't think the people who are writing that stuff were smart enough to think that much about stuff. No, I don't give them that kind of credit. I don't see, I see slavery very differently from what is in that clause. I see slavery as an institution where people can lose their families, okay? I know there's exploitation of labor. I know there's inability to come and go as you please, and in prisoners, it's the same situation. But prisoners are not having their children sold from them, and they never see them again. So I think that we sometimes do a disservice to what was going on during that period and what is going on now. I think it's two very different things. Is there a problem with the justice system in America? Heck, yes, there's a major problem. But I don't think it has anything to do with what's written in the 13th Amendment. No.
Okay, thank you, Edna.
Sure.
Wonderful job. Thank you, Edna, for a wonderful speech on this really great day, the 160th anniversary. So that's it for tonight. 8:30 tomorrow for a little continental breakfast, and then we start at 9 o'clock with some more lectures and some more learning and some more fun. So thank you, and we'll see you in the morning.